Hi, everyone. I'm John Chrastka, Executive Director for EveryLibrary and the EveryLibrary Institute. This is Values Aligned Budgeting, one in a series of trainings that we're doing for the Utah State Library. This is the November 2022 one. We're focusing for boards and directors mainly on this one, though anyone who's on staff at the library is welcome to attend. I'm going to be talking through a couple of different frameworks for how to position your budgeting cycle in relation to your strategic plan, but more importantly, in relation to the value system that the library has, that it resonates with your elected officials and funders and partners, and your community at large, whether they're users or non-users. We're going to be leveraging some of the learnings that we've had in other earlier webinars in this series. I'm not covering the same ground, but I am referencing back to certain aspects of how human beings are wired to think about how they spend their tax money. Because fundamentally, how public libraries put their tax money to work is a reflection of their value system, and the value system of the community should be, in a certain respect, represented by the services that are being done by the library. Okay, so let me get out of your way here with the screen sharing that you've seen my smiling face, and I want to take you through some of the high-level thinking around this topic. First off, EveryLibrary, if you have been watching previous trainings, we are set up as a political action committee for libraries. As a political action committee, we work on election days in many different states. We work on negotiations with city councils and county governments. We also support the legislative agenda for our state library partners, and there's certain things that we do around Congress as well. We do a lot of outreach and activism to voters, the voting public. On our EveryLibrary Institute side, which is where this training is rooted, it's our public policy, tax policy, education policy think tank. We have a research agenda around school libraries, public libraries, the future of librarianship. We produce training projects like this, as well as many different coalitions that we're involved in, from everything from the future funding formula for education to the structure of government to what are we doing right now in America with opposing censorship and book bans. The priorities that we're looking at talking about today around values-aligned budgeting are lined up with Utah state standards for public libraries. And I want to root us again in this training series about why we're having these kind of higher level conversations. Right now, there are priorities that the state library has for all the libraries in the state in order to bring everybody up to really the same level, that the strategic and long-range plans are necessary for good management as a board, as a library director, as other leadership in the library, the good management of taxpayer resources. This process is looking at the development of your strategic plan as well as the annual evaluations of your plan in an open, transparent, inclusive, and consultative way. We're trying to build up some skills here and get some thinking going that move beyond how we've been doing our budgeting process in that strategic planning framework previously. Many times the inertia that we have is to minimize, in a certain respect, the risk that goes into budgeting. I'm hoping to be able to provide a little bit of courage and make sure that we're looking at being comprehensive across our services, our facilities, et cetera, and that you know as well as I, what drives these kind of conversations in their ideal is where we are looking at the inputs of public funding and the outputs and the outcomes for the people we're looking to serve. Again, in that state library framework sort of way, as you're thinking through this budgeting process and how to bring your value system further along in it, it's around standard 3 of the 2022-2023 standards framework for Utah State Libraries. And we're going to start with the components around how mission, vision, and especially value systems are expressed in that budgeting process. All right, cool. Mission, vision, and values. That's nice. That's interesting. Whose values are we talking about? Whose mission, whose vision? And if you're going to start off with this process and say it's the libraries, I want to question that assumption. Because while our strategic plans are being made for and of the library, we are in a much larger civic, social, governmental funder landscape. So whose value system are we talking about when it comes to values-based budgeting? And this is a decision for you to be making, not for me, but I want to expose them to you. One is the value system of your elected officials. The value system of your elected officials who drive the agenda for the rest of your community. Are your library's agenda items mapped to those agendas? If your community is large enough or active enough to have its own strategic plan, your strategic plan needs to be in a position to dovetail that. But if it does not, or if the strategic plan is out of date, or if the strategic plan seems like it's too pro forma, the strategic initiatives of your elected officials still should be driving your conversation. If you'd watched an earlier session, you might remember a slide very much like this. What are the priorities of your elected officials? Most elected officials are not, in a context like in Utah, elected to do school activities. You have independent school boards in Utah. That is an important thing to remember when you're looking at how the agendas might be driving the value system. People got elected in your community and in my community to make more interesting places to live, more thriving places to live, more prosperous places to live. That triptych, yes, education lives inside it, perhaps inside thriving, perhaps it's inside prosperous, if you can look at education as a pathway to individual or family attainment. You definitely have an agenda, though, at the library and strategic priorities for your patrons where there's a value system around making a more interesting place to live. Should we be a place that does things that are cool, or at least engaging, or at least allow people to cultivate something other than isolation? Thriving certainly has those education elements, but it also has health and well-being. It has the different aspects of community cohesion and connection. Prosperous folks, there's nothing I want more than for folks to have the right kind of, making the right kind of living in a place that's worth living. So those kinds of top level value systems are expressed perhaps in the budget of the town or your county. They're expressed in the way that the city allocates its resources. Is that mapped to the library's strategic priorities as well? There are other elected officials, though, who are prioritizing initiatives around efficiencies, effectiveness, avoiding duplicative services. In a certain respect, they could talk about shrinking government, but they are still looking to see government function in ways that support individuals and families. Whether you're in an environment where there's expansion or if there's contraction, it's very important for you to understand how your library's strategic priorities are mapping to a value system that you may not necessarily control all the manifestations of. We're going to get to how you map it more effectively in a few moments. All right, your funders and partners, their value system, their mission, and their vision. Again, what are you looking to express in that strategic planning process? Yes, your own, but you're in a matrix, you're in an ecosystem. There's a question that I have for every single library that we work with in a strategic planning framework. And that fundamentally is whether or not you are a legitimately core institution in town or a complementary one. Core and complementary are two roles that libraries have potentially. They tend to be more preponderant one way or another. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but if you're a core institution in town, you behave differently, you're funded differently, your alignments around value systems and the strategic priorities for your organization are manifest more deeply in the rest of the community than if you're complementary. And there's nothing wrong with being complementary rather than core. It's an acknowledgement of both the current capacity that the library has, as well as the historic need that the library is attempting to address. And in a values-aligned budgeting framework, we need to be very cognizant of what the truth is about our work. Again, there's no merit to be core. There's no virtue to be core above complementary. What are you legitimately? But the question path that you need to ask in your budgeting frameworks is entirely different depending on what your status is. Core institutions ask, are our budget priorities focused on creating outcomes that only we can provide? Core institutions are in a position of solo work, whether you like it or not. We are the only institution in town that can do X, Y, and Z for a particular population. Or we can do, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G for our community. The only that we can provide is a driver for, yes, mission, certainly vision, but really the value system that you're trying to express in the community. Do we have a value system that is about taking care of people? Do we have a value system that is manifesting a pride of place, and that only the library, in its current comportment of activities, its structure, its funding framework, can provide those services and those supports? Or if you're a complementary institution, again, your budgeting framework needs to ask us a different kind of top level question. Are our goals congruent with those of our partners, and is our budgeting aligned with those goals? Meaning that if you are not the only game in town on literacy or on learning or on education, if you're not the only game in town on interesting, thriving, and prosperous, there's nothing wrong with that. How do you support those other parts of government, those other departments in your city, across your county? How do you support the other nonprofits, the other departments like schools or arts or parks? None of these are incorrect. It's all about where you really are. But a complementary institution asks, are our goals congruent with those partners? And that congruence should drive for you a lot about what it means to have a budget ask, because it is not relevant budgeting, nor is it values aligned budgeting for you to say we are doing something that we are not. Let's have an honest conversation with ourselves about core and complementary, and take a look at what the form of our organization is that allows us to function properly. All right, that's cool. Elected officials, partners and funders, and that core and complementary framework. And then, of course, in our strategic planning processes, how do we talk to patrons and also to non-users? Users and non-users are two different tribes. And there are different domains of questions that we would be asking them in a strategic planning process. That's a little bit of a future webinar series. But the fundamentals are, how do we understand what the value system is, not just the return on investment for our work? Whether we're in a core function or complementary function, whether we're talking about interesting places to live, thriving places, or prosperous places to live, what features do the patrons say that they want is both a demonstration of need and interest, as well as a place to root our value-based budgeting. If our values are to deliver the needs that our patrons have, let's do it. And if our value system is to say, we understand that the patrons are asking for X, Y, and Z, but we also identify A, B, and C ourselves, we are pretty good at our jobs. We've done a good job of evaluating not only what folks say they need, but we're also looking around the country, around Utah, or outside of libraries to bring other services in. Our value system is manifest in those features that we're bringing in from the outside as well. What's the delta, though? Meaning the difference between your performance and the perception of importance of the things that you're doing on the part of your patrons. The difference in that space might be, in some ways, what's the word I'm looking for here? Sometimes people say that they want something and that you're underperforming. Sometimes people say that you are doing too much with something they don't value. And to have a values-based budgeting conversation that's proper, we need to understand the differences in both positive and negative ways between those two things. And again, this is for a little bit later in our webinar series about strategic planning methodology. But what all of these different patron-facing questions manifest for us is, where are our value systems pointing to address the need and the want, and also to what extent? There's nothing that we are asking you to do in this value-based budgeting environment other than to deliver appropriate services in a competent fashion. Now, the non-user. How does the non-user value the work that you're doing for other people? Because the non-user has no self-interest in the work that you're doing for themselves. The non-user looks at you in a certain respect as either someone who's performing activities that may be understandable in a value-based framework, or the non-user looks at you as someone who is doing something that is truly a manifestation of some sort of civic grace, that you're taking care of people that the non-user would like to see taken care of. How much do they care, though, if it's being done by you or being done at all in the community? That is a difficult question to ask sometimes in strategic planning processes and prioritization, but it does let us know that, well, if the community is appreciative, if the community has deep care, and that you are seen as manifesting that deep care, of actualizing that deep care, it's very different than if the work that you're doing in your strategic priorities, in your day-to-day management, is underappreciated. There are ways to move that underappreciation forward if you want to continue it, but there are also moments of real reflection that are necessary. If we are not actually doing something that is being appreciated by the non-user, then are we really manifesting the community's value system or not? Okay, elected officials, their priorities, the funding community, your core or your complementary nature, and the differences between performance and perception for non-users and the level of appreciation, sorry, the performance and perception for users around the importance of what you're doing, the appreciation factor for non-users, we finally get to the library's own mission, vision, and values. I take this very seriously. Your budget, your values-based budget, is the most important thing that you could be working on after the strategic planning process, in the lead up to the strategic planning process, because it affects non-users and users alike. Yes, the user side receives some degree of benefit. There's expected and hoped for outcomes for them about your activity. There are shortfalls that you've identified that if you cannot reach, they persist, and non-users are affected by it because you're allocating their taxes. And are you allocating their taxes in a way that they see as being manifesting their own value system? Again, the preparation of your ballot, of your budget, being transparent, that is informed by research, which comes from community engagement data, understanding best practices, both internal and external to the library industry. This is a trust-based environment. Excuse me, this is a trust-based environment between the library and your community, not just between the library and your users. Okay, I want to talk about finding the shared values in this kind of context around taxes. It's an interesting conversation because what we have with a conversation around taxes is very different than a conversation around donor-facing activity. When we're preparing our budget, the nature of our funding should drive the frameworks around our budget prep, meaning that there are different kinds of money, and they manifest across different aspects of our mission, vision, values. Now, stick with me here for a minute, because this is kind of a theory of change approach to preparing our budget documents and preparing our budget justifications. The nature of the funding should influence the way we talk about it, because the different sources of the funding have different emotional as well as value system based attractors to them. Donors, we tend to want to talk about common mission when we're talking to donors about donor money. Small donors, big donors, philanthropy, big grant programs. A mission driven organizational framework tends to be the vocabulary that works best when we're talking about donors. We're talking with donors. Here's how our common mission is accomplished by their investment in us of funding for our collections program, services, and staffing. When we're talking about programmatic partners and the ways to put funding to work in very specific programmatic ways, or not even funding, but just common activities with programmatic partners, we tend to want to talk, in our opinion over here, about alignments and vision. We know where we're going as a community. We know where we want to go as a library. Do you want to go in the same direction? You look like you're wanting to go in the same direction. Let's put a class together that gets those people there. Let's stand up a workshop for them that moves them along. Programmatic partners thrive in a vision-based economy, and the alignment of vision means that we can work together in very strategic and tactical ways. But politics, which is where your tax money comes from, politics is driven by value systems. It's whether or not the budget of the community, the budget for the library, the budget for your city, state, America, is aligned with our value system is what creates both the tension within politics as well as the successes that happen in those political spaces. Celebrating a bipartisan victory in Congress, even those are few and far between, is when our value system lines up enough that we can actually get something done. We're going to be talking today really about the shared value system of politics rather than the mission aligned frameworks for talking to donors or the vision aligned programmatic partner points of leverage. They're all important, but today's conversation is about your values aligned budgeting around taxes, because moving that thing through city council, moving that thing through the regular political structure is the core. In most communities, it's somewhere north of 90% of your funding is coming from that values-based political conversation. Directly or indirectly, how we choose to tax ourselves and what values are expressed in our budgets, policies, and programs are fundamentally political in nature. I'm reading you the whole slide because it's one of our key thesis items at EveryLibrary and the EveryLibrary Institute. And it takes the right kind of vocabulary to do values-aligned budgeting properly, because otherwise you're going to have a disconnect between your mission-driven messaging or demonstrating how your vision for the future has been recognized and realized in the programming you're doing. I want to make sure we get this right and have it placed in the correct emotional and civil frameworks in order to not fail in this process. Here's why. Politics and decision-making in politics is based in values and identity. Again, if you've watched any of the earlier trainings, you'll have seen this slide before. If you want to have a little bit of a deeper refresher course, go back to them, because what creates political parties, what makes someone identify with a candidate, what has someone join a cause is not necessarily the specifics, though the devil is in the details on budgeting about how you're going to do something with a particular policy, with a particular feature, with a particular allocation of resources to collection services, staffing, programming. But how are we expressing in those activities the value system that we have as a community and the identity that we have as people who care? There are 4 ways that humans are wired to think and listen about ideas and ideals. And again, earlier webinar, a little bit deeper dive, but a refresher here for you. These are not held in common by any single individual, generally speaking. There are individuals, there are groups, there are stakeholders, there are movements, there are agencies that have this in a preponderance, one over the other. And understanding values-based budgeting framework, who you're talking to and how they will receive your information is absolutely necessary. Your budget prep and your budget justifications need to have an understanding across all 4 ways that humans are wired to listen about the ideals that you're expressing in your budget. People are engaged compassionately with populations and people. They care very much that we are taking care of our neighbors, the least among us, those folks who are in moments of transition and crisis, those folks who are in moments of growth. The compassion conversation needs to be in your budget documentation, your budget justifications, and in the structure of what you're trying to accomplish, because those folks that are out there as elected officials, as influencers who have that sort of compassion framework want to see their own value system being expressed in your budget. Likewise, there are people who are into systems thinking and pride of place. The pride conversation really drives a lot of elected officials, though, more so than not. The interesting place to live, the thriving place to live, the prosperous place to live, the agenda alignment, where you are looking at making place, is not the same in any way, shape, or form as the compassion agenda. In fact, a compassionate person looks at a systems person and thinks that they're cold. A pride of place person, a systems thinker, looks at a compassionate person and thinks that they're a little bit too drippy. So how do we balance in our values-based budgeting, not the work that we're doing in particular, because we can create interesting, thriving, and prosperous places to live with a compassionate agenda attached to them about how we take care of those in moments of need or crisis or growth. It's how do we phrase it. So the data type driven people are also in need of your understanding as you approach the budget prep that you need to do to move your values-based budgeting forward. A lot of administrators of different cities and counties that I'm aware of, states, a lot of folks who are in the position to chair a budget committee, they need the numbers. They need the numbers in order to understand that this is not just some sort of a story about compassion or some sort of a pipe dream about pride. The numbers have to demonstrate in here. And this goes back to the standards that the state library has there about data-driven decision-making to provide for them a framework that demonstrates inputs lead to outputs, which lead to outcomes. Your budget prep has to include that kind of material, perhaps above and beyond in your particular context, but that's only for the meeting that you're having with the administrator, with the committee. The marketing of your budget and the demonstration to the broader community about value system runs through a narrative about compassion and about pride as well. Don't undersell yourself. The concern or fear framework for how people are wired to talk about ideas and ideals may also be operative where you are. As we're moving through 2022 into 2023, as we're moving further away from the COVID crisis, this concern or fear-based decision-making may be diminishing in your place. But if it is still operative, if the key reasons that we are making decisions about how we put our limited amount of tax money to work, if it's driven by a focus on gap filling or a focus on crisis response, then everything I've said up to now is trumped by that situation. Yes, we are compassionately engaged with people in a crisis response mode. Yes, we are looking to get our community get back up on its feet in a pride mode, and that we've got the data to demonstrate that if we put a small amount of smart tax money to work on these things, we'll fix the big problems. But that frame around crisis is an overriding frame. If it's authentic and happening in your community, then please lean into it. If it's diminishing as we move further away from the depths of the pandemic and the financial crises, so much the better. Across all of those different ways that people are wired, what triggers a values systems conversation for people and allows for values-based budgeting that's successful is understanding whether or not the people that you're talking to, the people that you're trying to get your budget passed by, the people who are trying to find new ways to fund your work, the political narratives, because this is political money, it's taxpayer money. We're not talking about donors here, because in the main, your support's coming from politics, it's coming from taxes. The political frames matter a great deal in terms of whether or not your values are being recognized as being common values and preponderant values in your community. It's because progressives tell a hero story and a villain narrative differently than conservatives and differently than libertarians that I bring this up. Because value systems support a hero narrative, values are offended by a villain narrative, meaning that in a progressive political idiom, your heroes are somebody who looks out for the underprivileged, somebody who looks out for people in moments of transition and crisis. Progressives, villains are folks who are politicians, actors out in the political world who don't care about the underprivileged, who don't care about people in moments of transition or crisis, who don't care about women, the minorities, and the poor. The value system of budgeting, the value system that's manifest in your budgeting, if you're in a very progressive community, looks very different than the value systems in a conservative or more libertarian community where the hero narratives have significant differences. A conservative hero narrative are people who have looked out for Western values. And the villain narrative are people who are destroying Western values. That Western values concept in shorthand in conservative spaces means that are we doing things that, with our tax money, that protect and extend the way things, well, possibly have been done, but the frameworks for why we have been doing them. And I can tell you that the hero narrative in a conservative space is looking at compassion and pride as well as in a progressive space. That there's no differences between fundamentally how we would like to take care of each other. It's the vocabulary behind it that makes it either look like something that is aligned with our values, or it looks like something that is variant with and therefore offensive to our values. In some communities, the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion runs right through this combine. And changing vocabulary without changing our core, our compass, might be important for you, because questions around fairness might land better than questions around equity. And solutions for fairness in a more conservative space might land more on better ears than ones that sound like they're coming from the big city or the left coast. Libertarians are a whole other matter. And in Utah and a lot of neck of the woods is out there, there is a nascent libertarian movement, or a growing libertarian movement, which looks at as a hero narrative ways that we have lowered barriers through government. We've lowered barriers to individual attainment. That lowering of barriers, well, the villain narrative in those libertarian contexts is somebody who's put more barriers in place. We've made it more difficult for people to achieve their own bliss. The value systems that are inherent in a libertarian construct, again, are not variant from a progressive one. How do we help people in moments of transition and crisis? The idea that on the progressive side, we're helping people apply for government benefits might look like government overreach to a libertarian, but how do we lower barriers to people to participate in the economy also looks like job skills training, supports for proper technology in your library building so people can get on the global economy. We have to have a deep reflection about the stories we like to tell ourselves right now based on our own leadership teams, political framework. We have to be in a position to talk to the funding partner, our municipal funding partners, and even our donor funding partners about how our value system and their value system, no, I'm sorry, let me rephrase, how our work manifests their value system as well as our value system. All right, so there's three principles for communications when your community does not align with the library's own political speech. If the library is very progressive, and sometimes it is, and the community is rather conservative or libertarian, sometimes it is, if there's not a lot of cohesion across the political spectrum between progressives out in the world, conservatives out in the world, and libertarians out in the world, folks, I want to give you three quick tips, and we can talk about this more one-on-one when we do some coaching and consultation calls. But if your community is not of one mind about a political idiom, that's fine. We have to find whether or not the work that we're trying to get funded is a common cause for a population or a common concern for a place. It fundamentally is, okay, are we going to have a compassion conversation or a pride conversation? That cuts across political speech, provided that we find the synonyms for what we are trying to accomplish and what we're trying to do at the library. If we find synonyms for those other political modes, the synonyms about are we trying to take care of the homeless, or are we trying to help veterans get back up on their feet? Those are two very similar populations sometimes in some places. Are we trying to do something for the homeless because we're progressives, or are we trying to honor the men and women who used to wear the uniform in their time of trouble? Folks, the synonyms across this political speech means that we are able then to make sure that there's a hero narrative across decision making rather than any activity by the library being villainized across any of those political images. This is not, again, asking you to change a darn thing that you're doing. It's making the budget briefing book resonate not just with your own values, but the values of your elected officials, your funding partners, your programmatic partners, the non-users in the community, as well as that small but extremely important group of users who are going to benefit from it directly. All right, that's heterogeneous. Not everybody's of the same mind. There's a lot of political, et cetera, going on. Let's talk about what happens if the community that you're serving tends to be a little bit more homogenous. It's really more about like your hometown. This is where we are from. We kind of all get it. We're all on the same page, whether it's libertarians standing up for the rights of the individuals, if it's the conservatives who are standing at the gate, holding back the barbarians, or if it's the progressives who believe that there's power in a factory, power in the land, and power in the hands of the worker. All right. We have to still consider our own idioms and our own vocabulary when we are writing a values-based budget book. We have to, because right now your institution, and if you're watching this casually just to see what John's got to say in the November 2022 training about values-based budgeting, thanks for sticking with me this long. But if you've been joining me because your budget isn't quite adequate yet, are we really aligned? Are we really of our hometown? The idioms and vocabulary that we're using might be slightly disconnected. It might be that we are too far along in a mode of library or librarian speech ourselves, and we have to change our vocabulary in order for it to make sense to people, for them to be able to hear what we're saying in a way that their value systems can also be affirmed by our activity, and that their concerns about whether or not their value systems are offended are demonstrated as well in shortfalls to our budgeting. We have to decide in our hometown framework here, our homogenous community framework, about whether we're talking about compassion or pride or problem solving in that crisis response mode, and stick with it. There's nothing worse in a values-based budgeting environment where you're trying to communicate with folks across multiple shifting, like what are we trying to talk about here, folks? Are we a compassionate community or are we a pride community? And pride here is not one of the virtues, one of the vices, nor is compassion one of the virtues. What we have to be able to do is utilize that frame in a way that's true within the context of this homogenous community, your hometown. We have to talk about our shared identity in that envelope as well. That the reason that one funds the library is not abstract. It is very much about a manifestation of our shared identity and our shared values. It's not just principle driven, it is mission and vision as well. But if you are in a position where you've been hanging with me here now for 18 slides, and you're like, okay, John, I need something here, because we're not properly funded even in our own hometown, there is something that we need to be addressing, which is the suspicions of our funding partners in your municipalities. They right now may not believe you. You may tell them that that we are aligned around compassion or pride or problem solving. You may have solved the vocabulary problem, and for those elected officials and those budget administrators and those funders, those decision makers who don't come in, you've been able to communicate with them effectively. But what's holding them back from properly funding you to manifest a shared value system is that they have some suspicions. They have some suspicions about whether or not there is veracity to what you're telling them. And they have some suspicions that whether you're in a core or complementary environment as the library, your absence would make it any worse. Your presence makes any real difference. This is a hard thing for me to say here on slide 18, because the suspicions that they have, they're probably illegitimate suspicions. They're probably not based in anything that's really going on. They're simply suspicious because they haven't been listening or they haven't been paying attention. And yet we have something where we are not being seen as being the enactors of a shared values framework in our hometown already. I want to take the rest of this conversation today and address that more so than anything else. That the heterogeneous community has an opportunity to benefit from this in terms of being better at communications around values manifestation budgeting. But the heterogeneous community where you have been underfunded historically or traditionally, I think you have a lot to benefit from this rest of this conversation as well. All right, let's motivate decision making that's positive about our budgeting through a different message frame, whether we are in a heterogeneous or homogeneous kind of environment, whether we are talking about a library that is a core or complementary function. Here we go. The budgets in our taxpayer-funded environment express our values. It's why we fight so hard to get back in power when we're out of power as politicians or elected officials or issue advocacy organizations. The control of the purse is the way that we make sure that what we care about is taken care of. Is your library's own budget in line with your own values? Is my first question for you when you're in that heterogeneous or homogeneous kind of way. But it's particularly if there has been suspicions about you previously, whether they've been vocalized or not, are you actually passing what is commonly referred to as the duck test? Do you walk like a duck, talk like a duck, quack like a duck? Or is there some part of you that doesn't really look like a library? Is your budget right now not currently representing itself by either your programs, your services, your activities, your staffing, in the way that has been agreed to about how your budget works? Is your strategic plan in need of not just updating, but of better communications? Because the majority of your community, or at least the majority of your funders, don't agree that the strategic plan is a legitimate plan in light of what a library is supposed to be doing. How much education needs to go on, how much orientation needs to go on before you can have a properly funded framework to advance your strategic priorities? If the folks in the community either misunderstand, underappreciate, or even oppose some of the work that you're intending to do. Likewise, if you are not currently budgeting with in your current level of budget, if you are currently not budgeting for your value system, it's going to be very difficult to convince people that they should add more money to something that you're not doing already properly, according to your value system. The authenticity of the work that you do every day needs to be considered. I'm not suggesting I'm calling it into question, but if there is suspicion and disconnects, it has to start with revising your framework at home. Then, the honesty of whether or not your library's work is core or complementary. We would like to be, forgive me, you may really want to be core and you might not be. You might be complementary. Vice versa. You might be wanting to be complementary, but you keep getting dragged into things that you don't want to, that somebody's got to do. Who the heck else is going to do it? Are your city's strategic priorities embedded in your plans? Will help you make a decision about how you're supposed to be, though. Because if the city itself is not planning with you, if they're planning around you, that's one thing. If they're planning in spite of you, that's a whole other. The location of your library in relation to the fundamentals of why the city exists, that will determine whether or not you're truly core or truly complementary. And the congruence of your goals with your partners. If you are acting independently across the majority of your service provision, you are either core or you are very bad at being complementary. No offense. Because if you are doing things that are complementary without having actual partnerships across those different areas, then you're trying to establish a core reputation or a core you're trying to keep yourself core in a place where there's a lot of other activity happening that you should just be complementary to. Again, neither is virtuous, neither is a vice. I'm asking for that moment of deep reflection because the budget, if it is going to be driven by value system, needs to know where it's going to land. The authenticity of your strategic plan and plan of service has to be at the fundamental root of all of this. And the authenticity is driven by whether or not it is meeting understood needs of your patrons, anticipating or bringing in those best practices, and some level of appreciation on the part of the non-user for you putting their value system to work. So, all of that kind of deep reflection in mind, for your values-based budgeting to be successful, we also have to take a look sincerely at where money comes from. Because right now, if you are inadequately funded, there has to be a plan that is legitimate for bringing in funding from other places that are currently being funded improperly compared to you as either a core institution or a complementary one. Those four places are cuts within a department of a municipality. That means that something else gets cut and you don't. It also could be interpreted here as being efficiencies within your own department. I'll give you that, but I'm talking about actual growth rather than some sort of attrition-based approach to managing your budget. Reallocations within an existing tax framework means that if there are things that are not going well someplace else, they bring it over to you. And if you are core, it means bringing on more core. If you're complementary, it means bringing on more capacity to be more effective as a complementary. Outside aid or grants is both true about where money can come from, but it's not tax money. That's donor money, or it's grant money, it's philanthropy money. There's a difference in the framework, and it is to say we'll paper over our budget challenges with a grant or aid that's coming in from the outside is the last refuge of the municipal budget cycle scoundrel. Additional taxes, folks, are probably what's needed in order to add the right kind of capacity for your values-aligned budgeting for your mission-driven organization with a vision for what happens tomorrow. The motivation for that amongst your municipal partners, whether it's going to be to make a cut someplace and secure better funding, to reallocate activity across the departments, or to bring up the level of taxes for your library or for the municipality in order to meet need, takes a lot of political courage. The problem that we also have to be considering when we're doing values-based budgeting is that your city council, your budget manager, your city administrator, the budget committee cares about numbers. And of course, your library board and your library administration should as well. But most people are what they call enumerate, meaning that they are not necessarily literate about numbers. And to say that they're not capable of making sense of numbers and don't respond to numbers in a logical way is me being polite. Most people, there's a big conundrum that we have in planning circles around trying to talk about the numbers behind something, and you have to. Books cost some money, programs cost some money, people cost a lot of money, buildings cost a lot of money. The people in charge of the budget need your accurate numbers and cogent budget justifications, despite the fact that the numbers are going to make people glass over. And yet the numbers are the manifestation of the value system in this political conversation. The tension is resolved, though. The tension is resolved by articulating outcomes or articulating shortfalls. What affirms a value system is outcomes that say we are taking care of people in libertarian, conservative, or progressive ways. There's outcomes that we expect or hope for if the funding comes, and that there are shortfalls that will persist and they will offend our value system. So whether it's a particular dollars and cents conversation within a committee, what happens if we don't do the work? What happens if we're not in a position to either be core or complementary across compassion or pride? The shortfalls conversation is difficult to have at times because we have been conditioned in library land to do more with less for way too long. And we have to be able to articulate for people who are not understanding what the presence of numbers is, the presence of money, in particular dollar amounts are, let alone they don't understand what the absence of that looks like either. It looks like it's virtuous to cut taxes when in fact it is an abundant society that we have, and we should be funding ourselves more based on potential outcomes, expected and hoped for outcomes. Yet articulating the shortfalls that will happen cuts across numeracy illiteracies, because we are the people who are expert enough in library services to say if we're missing as a core institution, if we're absent as a complementary partner, those people that we care about or this place we call home will be lacking in measurable ways. What are the expected and hoped for outcomes for a project, a feature like a collection, or a position like a staff member? What are the expected and hoped for outcomes of putting this small amount of smart tax money to work? And what are the cautions that we have or the concerns we have, again, across pride or compassion, if those outcomes are not met? The budget brief for a values-based budgeting environment has to articulate both of those things and put a dollar to it. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to activate that the value system and affirm it, nor are you going to be able to ensure that our tax money, which is a political conversation, is present enough in a context where if it's missing, it would be offensive. We have to talk about Plan B as well as Plan A in our values-based budgeting briefing book, in our values-based budgeting projections, in our values-based budgeting plan of service and manifestations. Plan A, what happens if we are properly funded or empowered? Plan B, what happens if we are underfunded or disempowered? As experts in the library field, experts in putting compassion to work, and experts in putting pride of place into action, we have to define these negatives and these positives in order for our values-based budgeting to be advanced properly. Nobody's going to raise taxes for something that they don't understand. Well, that happens all the time actually around the country. People raise taxes or cut taxes about things that they don't have any understanding of when it comes to numeracy, the dollars and cents of it all. I mean, the federal budget alone is impractically large and opaque as a devil. How are we taking care of the other? And how are we not going to be able to take care of the other? How are we going to build place? How are we going to let this place slide? Folks, Plan A and Plan B are core to a values-based budgeting framework that exceeds everything else. In fact, proper funding reinforces our shared value system. Plan A, so that we can, is the vocabulary that we suggest over here at EveryLibrary. We're asking for this money so that we can do certain things for certain people, so that we can build place together in our hometown. Improper funding offends our value system. Plan B, if we don't get this money, it means we cannot or we won't be core or complementary, as is our way. There's two main frames for funding us in a values-based budgeting environment that relate to Plan A and Plan B. It's whether or not the work that we're trying to accomplish with proper funding is going to replicate or scale our success, because stories of success that we tell with the numbers, but also with the expected and hoped for outcomes, the narratives around pride or around compassion, we want to scale something up, we want to replicate our success in a different area, we have been competent before. So the framework in our budget narrative, our values-based budgeting, is to say we've been good at it before, we want to do it again. And if that's legitimate, then that's what we lean in on. And I'll show you another slide in just a moment of some of the narrative that brings this all together. Or we need to be equally honest, because it takes honesty to say we're good at it. Let me tell you about how I'm good at this, how we're good at this activity, how we have achieved a set of outcomes. We took a small amount of smart tax money as an input. We did a certain kind of activities as an output. We have outcomes that have been achieved. Let me crow about it for a little bit. The same kind of courage it takes to talk about failure. Your own failure, perhaps, and how you can fix it. you have integrity to fix it with the right kind of budget allocation, or you have the integrity to either avert crisis or address the failures that are happening. It's not always internally that there's failure. It's not always internally. That's not what I'm suggesting here. This isn't a situation where it's like if we don't if we don't get this funding allocation next fiscal year, we will somehow or another fail internally. It's that there's a failure of our compassion. We can't manifest our compassion. We can't take care of people properly. Though sometimes failure could be the roof's going to collapse, and that's a whole other kind of budget briefing. In the absence of that potential impending crisis, if we are looking to bring in new funding to avert a problem, avert a failure, address a failure for that population, we can't manifest not just our compassion, we can't manifest our pride of place. We can't continue to build a more interesting, thriving, and prosperous community. One or the other here, folks. Stories of success or stories of failure. The chance to scale up our work or replicate our work in a success framework, the chance to avert a crisis that's impending or address a crisis that's current in that failure framework, both of those are value systems focused frameworks for our communications. All right, let me put it all together for you. Extending success. If you have a legitimate budget framework in your strategic planning process that says we have to be, we are good at what we're doing, we're competent in it, we want to extend that success, the formula for values-based budgeting comes down to this. We, the library, are asking to scale up our success or replicate our success in a certain place. It's been measured. It's been, we have outcomes that we can prove. We have outputs, at least, that we can demonstrate. We want to scale up or replicate a service or a feature that has a particular set of characteristics. Those characteristics are around pride, or they're around compassion, generally speaking. Sometimes they're around crisis response as well. New funding means that we will do X or Y. And I don't know if you're talking about a service or a feature or even staffing, but they can do X, Y, or Z for a particular population or place, depending on whether it's a compassion frame or pride frame, in order to support a known outcome, which is scaling up our success. I'm sorry, forgive me. A known outcome is replicating our success in another place. We're good at story time. We want to do senior services better. We have a known outcome about story time. We want to do that in another place, like senior services, or at a new level for a new expected outcome, which is scaling up. And scaling up our services means if we only had one more youth services librarian, what could we do? If we had a large print collection, what could we do? If we could have 10 more computers, what could we be doing to manifest our value system across progressive and conservative and libertarian frames of hero narrative? We have been competent at doing the services or maximizing the features previously. Here's our measurable, data-driven proffer of information. Without the new funding, and this is where we want to be able to articulate how our value system would be offended if we didn't have this new feature or service coming in with these particular characteristics. Without the new funding, a clearly defined negative for either our population that we have compassion about or place that we have pride about will persist. That offends our shared values about compassion or pride. Folks, this is for overall asks. This is for a big feature that you want to add in. This idea of extending success is iterative over many years of a strategic planning process. If your strategic plan is a 3-year or 5-year event horizon, this is an annual conversation proactively with your budget briefing book, the marketing that you're doing out to the community, and the reflection that you have with your annual report and other communications to your taxpayers, not just to your users, about how you've done the work that you said you were going to do. Likewise, let me put it all together for you if it's a fixed failure campaign. Fixing failure, again, is averting or addressing a crisis. We, the library, are asking for a funded feature: collection, program, services, staffing, no offense to staff, facilities, a funded feature in order to prevent a problem or immediately address a problem. And those are different situations, whichever one is actual or relevant. But coming through COVID, there's a lot of problems to prevent about literacy, about school readiness, about community cohesion, about wellness, or immediately address a problem. Folks, we're sitting right now in the wrong place for those people or this place we call home, and we, as a core or complementary institution, can address it right away. New funding means that we can do PD or Q, service for that particular population or place, in order to create a new or improved outcome. And again, this is data driven. If you've never done the particular activity before, your outcomes, the data for those outcomes has to come from external sources than your library and your community. And that's fine. That's why we have standards in the library industry. That's why we have peer-to-peer sharing. That's why you can look across a border, whether it's to the next town over or across the country, and say, if we were to bring in a service, a feature, an activity, or a type of staff, we can create a new or improved outcome, which affirms a value system that cuts across progressive, conservative, and libertarian values. The core or complementary institution that we are, we have the integrity and the competencies to actually do the work if we receive the funding. And you have to vouch for yourself. If you don't vouch for yourself here, no one's going to vouch for you independently. They haven't yet done it. And then you have to name what happens if you don't get the funding. Because everything else here is a nice idea around budgeting, but what happens if you don't get the funding? Without the new funding, the crises, which is an offense to our identified shared values about either people or place, will persist or even deepen. And folks, that takes a tremendous amount of courage to do. Plan B is very hard. What happens if we don't? And to go into your values-based budgeting framework, to say we have strategic priorities that have been arrived at through consultation with our community and stakeholders. We've done surveys, we've done community charrettes, we've done all the work of understanding what people need. We've brought our competencies and our expertise to say what else we should be doing. We've validated it with non-users. We think that we've got the right kind of idiom across all three types of political speech. We believe firmly that the compassion or pride lens is the right way to go. We have to define, because we're the only experts in libraries. You folks on the board, you folks in library leadership, you're the only experts in libraries. What is the potential for reduced access to services? What do fewer hours, say, for services mean? Fewer staff, longer response times in that expected and hoped for, forgive me, in that defined negative. What do fewer hours mean? The only folks who can define that are you. Do not let someone external to the library define that. What is the potential for reduced quality of service? If cuts are likely, what is lower quality of service? Perhaps to the point where it no longer meets the public's need. What does that mean? We have to be willing, we have to be competent in defining that and advancing that discussion in our values-based budget briefing book, because no one else is. No one else can but your leadership team. Where is the service delivered and to whom? Again, if it's missing from a particular neighborhood, if it's missing from a particular demographic, if it's missing from a particular set of needs, either in space or time around somebody's life, services that are delivered to a specific community usually pose the greatest risk to exacerbating inequities if cut. Are we less fair in our community? Are we creating too many barriers? Plan B is really hard, and I'm not suggesting anything other than that. Yes, it takes a lot of work to develop a framework that is looking at expected and hoped for outcomes, that is trying to manifest a value system that realizes a vision, is as a mission-driven organization, is bringing the right people, the right resources. But what happens if we don't or can't is truly the main driver for budgeting that is based legitimately in value systems. The frame around marketing this is another webinar coming up. The frame around marketing it And I'm using marketing very deliberately here because we market our services that we're trying to get funded properly in a values-based budgeting environment to manifest our strategic priorities. The marketing of it is to people who are current users or potential users to encourage their uptake, and then we can measure their outcomes. But the marketing that we need to be doing in this values-based budgeting environment is marketing yesterday to describe how the impact of what we did on those populations that we care about in a compassion lens, or this place we call home in that pride lens. Again, that's a longer conversation for another seminar, which is coming up in the next couple of months. Okay, folks, took you through a lot. I want to give you one more bit of insight. This is a little bonus section that might be useful to you if you're looking to alter the way that you're doing your budgeting right now. Because if your budgeting framework is not, what's the word I'm looking for, malleable enough to get you through where we got to today after 30 slides, I want to suggest that maybe you need to alter the way that you're doing your budgeting in some ways, because if we're looking to make sure that our value system is manifest in our budgets, then we have to be budgeting not from an inertia-based perspective or protective approach. Traditional budgeting techniques are usually set up in a way that are designed to decrease or avoid conflict among stakeholders. The status quo funding formula tends to be the way that cities, unless they're in crisis, or states for that matter, unless they're in a windfall, will behave. Now, everybody gets what they had last year. Take it or leave it. Do what you can with what you got. You have to work in ways that break the current budgetary, the current budgeting approach. And I'm not suggesting that everyone's going to be capable of doing this with their city on day one. But if the library board and the library staff have control of at least the budgeting process for your department, there might be an interesting way for you to go forward. I'm bringing up a framework called participatory budgeting for your consideration here today. Participatory budgeting is a different mode of doing budgets for municipalities, for states, for mission-driven organizations that has a very good theory of change framework behind it that might be inspiring. Now, I'm not suggesting you have to do it in order to get to the places that we've been talking about. You can certainly work on bending these narratives, but to have a different mode where participation in setting budget priorities is a way to reflect on what the true value system is of the community might be the more authentic approach. Participatory budgeting, again, authentic pathways to root budget priorities in need and to validate it in light of shared values. We all identify that the folks who are experiencing homelessness are in crisis themselves. How do we, as libertarians, conservatives, and progressives, address that? What are the words that we use? What are the limits to our compassion? How is that a manifestation of our pride about taking care of the other and our neighbors? Whether you're in a heterogeneous or a homogeneous community, having those conversations about shared values prior to having the conversation about the budget amount, you need a mechanism to do it that might be a safer place than what currently is the budgeting environment, which is to try and keep it from getting any weirder or worse than it already is. We don't need another fight on our hands. Participatory budgeting is fundamentally a democratic, small d democratic process in which there's a lot of what's the word I'm looking for here? Community members decide how to spend a part of the public budget in a very flat way. Everybody's voice matters. And not to suggest that you're looking to take over the budgeting process of the city. You have elected officials in our republic. You have elected officials or appointed officials on your library board who are responsible for the majority of it. What we want to be able to do is give people some real power over a certain part of your budget. It might be a collection development choice. It might be a way to staff or to do programming differently. This participatory budget framework is on a wonderful website by a great organization called participatorybudgeting.org. They will take you through the process of designing the approach, brainstorming the ideas, the process of developing proposals within this PB framework, of voting in a very, very small d democratic way amongst the group, and allocating funding. than for those particular projects that succeed in this framework. Small towns, big cities. I mean, I'm in suburban Chicago, folks. City of Chicago has been doing versions of participatory budgeting now for a number of years in order to bring more people into the process and to make sure that our value system is reflected in a big old budget over there. I think that there's something to be said for this, and I want to share with you a good framework from EveryLibrary Institute's 2022 Library Advocacy and Funding Conference, which was just back in September. The Library Advocacy Funding Conference, we invited folks from the Participatory Budgeting Project to do a seminar with us. You're going to have this link in the landing page for this webinar as well. You can watch it for free. If it's interesting to you, you can pursue it with them. We are looking to do more of this kind of work across libraries to bring in this more democratic approach, because if we can talk to enough of our neighbors across political lines, if we can bring in more authentic representation from folks who are maybe users, but definitely from the non-user category, we can achieve what I think is a values-based approach, because we are listening to what the values truly are. And amongst Americans, amongst human beings, that pride and that compassion story tend to be very similar, regardless of what particular sheen we put on it. So I'm going to invite you to do that. I hope that it would be interesting to you. Let me bring it all back to what we're doing here in this webinar series. Again, this one today intended for library boards and library leadership teams. I hope other staff members enjoyed it as well. We are looking to make sure that your approach to strategic planning is within the Utah State Library standards, and we are here to help at Every Library in moving you forward in these kind of conversations. My contact information is here as the executive director. I do a lot of one-on-one consulting with boards and library directors. We're here to help you think this thing through. Thank you. We'll see you on the next one of our webinar series shortly. Be well, team.